I've spent the last couple of weeks modding my revamp of Delfino Square into Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, and today I want to get it to a passable point. It won't be as good as it can be, but I can't just leave it how it currently is. So the first thing I'm going to do is replace that fence by the park. The sign just doesn't really work, and the posts would be pretty annoying to replace. Plus, there's already a fence in this map that I probably should have used, so let's do that.
There's already fences here. Separate that, do shift right click to move the cursor there. We could use selection to cursor, use period to zoom into it, rotate it 90, check which side the normals are on. Switch to that side. Not messing that up again. So we already have the collision map here, so I'm hoping I won't need to mess with that. This sucks. Alright, we'll try that.
The next thing I want to do is replace the Animal Crossing trees with the original trees that I made for this model. Now this should have worked pretty well, since I've already placed these Animal Crossing trees everywhere. So if I just replace the Animal Crossing trees in the files with my old trees, we should be all good. But unfortunately, I ended up spending about 2 hours on that, and it never worked. It was a pretty neat process though. It involved using a software that's new to me at this point called Switch Toolbox. Here I can preview and modify in-game objects. And while it did actually work in Track Studio, replacing the files for the game didn't work. I would later learn why this was probably the case. So if I can't have the trees replace the ones that I've already placed in Track Studio, then I'll just have to delete those and bring the trees back in Blender. Now these look a little weird in game, but I think that's partially because they need a shadow map, which I'm kind of terrified to learn how to make, so let's do something else first. I spent a few minutes driving around the track looking for little things that need fixing. This sign's normal map needs to be mirrored. These shutters are kind of a hazard, so they'll go. And this window isn't even appearing, so I'll make it 3D and push it out a bit. But there's also that not-so-little issue where the track isn't playable because you can't complete laps. I asked the Track Studio Discord about this, and it seems that it's got something to do with how ridiculously out of whack my lap points are. Surprisingly, I didn't think this mattered, having everything just sitting in one path group. So I need the first path to be group 0, which splits into group 1 and 2. Then 1 and 2 rejoin into group 3. I tried separating the existing points into path groups, but that was acting really glitchy, and when I tried recreating some of the earlier points, they were created as later points. So I had a random point 40 sitting next to point 33 and 34. That's when I just decided to delete everything past this split and recreate it all with the path groups in mind this time. And
Yes! Yes!
well, that's good. Now that the gameplay side of the track is mostly there, I need to focus on some of the key visual components that are still missing.
Okay, so water. Should be pretty easy. Place. Yeah, that's not gonna look right on there. No, just this. Yeah, that's more like it. And then water. Fallout. Water. Hey! Whoa! Don't think I have the out of bounds set low enough for that.
Now I thought the issue was that the path boundaries I set up weren't letting me fall low enough to enter the water, but I fixed that and it still wasn't working.
I think the fallout zone. What? What?
I think what my cat was trying to tell me is that if you fall below the game's world origin floor, that in itself is considered outside the game area, which is probably a safeguard to keep you from falling forever in case you manage to fall between anything that would trigger Lakitu. So I moved the whole model, including the collision model, a decent bit upwards.
Yeah. Whoa. What's happening?
The next thing I want to do is scale the track up a bit, since it still feels a bit cramped. So I brought it up by another 20% and exported it. Now we have some crap to deal with in Track Studio, because everything's not where it should be.
Oh, goodness. Oh no. It's terrible.
Scaling it up brought it almost where it should be, but there was still some manual adjusting to do. I also had to move all of the game objects. But once it's done, we've got some more room in the alleyway. We also can't even go down to the dock now, because the model expanded downward when I scaled it up. So I adjusted it in Blender, moved everything back in place in Track Studio, and tested it. And somehow nothing changed. but that's actually because I never even replaced the files that the game uses with the ones that I had just now made changes to. And it's still a pretty good ways off. So I raised it up considerably and re-exported and re-imported and re-raised everything and completely remade the enemy paths because I had neglected those until now, and then resaved over the old stuff and relaunched the game and retested it. And rejoiced, because it actually works now. Okay, we have an ocean. The next thing I want to do that's sort of half gameplay and half visual is the minimap, because right now it's just the Mario Circuit minimap, and you just fly around independent of it. Now I'm not sure how you make a minimap, but I do see a minimap editor menu. But this just looks like I'm calling in an airstrike on Delfino Square. I'll keep this airstrike menu in mind in case things get out of hand with this mod, but I need to figure out how to make a minimap first. So I went back to Squadaloo's tutorial playlist and found a video on minimaps. The first thing I need to do is make a duplicate of the collision model and get rid of anything that isn't the road. Then I can just put a plain material on this, but I kept the finish line material so that you can sort of see where it is on the map. Now I can export this from Blender and import it into a new project in Track Studio. Then over in the minimap editor, I can line it up at a skewed angle to give it some depth, and then take a screenshot. Then I can touch it up in Photoshop with a bit of a drop shadow. After that, I can close Track Studio and forget to save the camera, and have to do all of that over again. But after saving the camera and taking another screenshot, I can open Switch Toolbox. But I can't seem to find the BNTX file that's supposed to be in here. And that's because these files are from Mario Kart 8 for the Wii U, not Deluxe. That's also probably why those Animal Crossing trees weren't working. And thanks to the Track Studio Discord, I learned that you can extract the game data in the emulator. Now I can load the BNTX file, replace the image, and save that into my mod folder. And boom, we've got a minimap. Alright, this is looking pretty good, but I think it's finally time to deal with the shadow map. In case you're wondering what a shadow map is, it's an image that the game uses to place shadows on your model, because while it will simulate some shadows for game objects, it would be way too taxing to ray trace lighting for all of your map geometry in real time. So instead, you do that once in Blender and bake an image of those shadows, which can then be statically overlaid onto your textures in your track. But there are quite a few steps in this process, and since baking the maps can take quite some time, mistakes are costly. So after watching over an hour of tutorial and taking notes, I went into Blender and started getting things set up. I made a sunlight to cast shadows, and I went ahead and scaled my model down to 0.1, since things were pretty glitchy at a supermassive scale. And I made sure to save this model as a new file, in case I messed something up during the process. So now I want to go to each texture and make a UV map called Bake Map. Actually, I don't really want to, but I have to in order to get the bake maps. Then I can go to the shader editor and make a UV map node, which is selected on our bake map that we just made. Then I can plug that into an image texture node. But where I would usually use an image texture node to feed an image into a material, here I'm using it more like an output for the end result of our bake maps. Now I can just copy these nodes and paste them onto every other material in our scene, so that when we bake maps, they'll create a new texture. But before we bake anything, I want to organize things a bit, because one map isn't going to work here. I'm going to need to split this model into several parts, because while a 4096 by 4096 texture is pretty huge, it isn't enough to properly represent all 188,000 triangles of my model, and it's not really a good idea to just scale up the resolution of the shadow map. So the solution is to break things up into a few different groups. After doing that, I selected my first group, which was mostly floor textures, and re-unwrapped it with Smart UV Project. It took a little bit of messing with island margin size, but now I've got things inventoried into a nice UV map. One thing that's wrong with this though is that the water in this out of bounds area are getting way too much space, just because they're large in the scene, but they don't really need to be super detailed. So I'll just re-unwrap everything without them selected, and then make a little bit of room for them on the texture. Then I set the bake type to shadow and the margin down to 4 and started the bake. And pretty quickly things went wrong. So it turns out that I didn't have the bake map selected in the shader editor when I went to bake, so it's just baking this image onto everything's texture. Luckily it's not doing anything to any of my actual texture files, so I can just reload them. And after going to each material and selecting that bake map node, I can bake again. And as you can see, one by one, it's baking shadow maps for each material and outputting them to this texture. Once it's done, I can go to Image and Save As. But this isn't the only map we need. We also want to grab an ambient occlusion map as well. I carried on making shadow and AO maps for each group until I had 5 sets of images. Some were a little more ridiculous and terrifying, like the maps for the trees, but even though there were 5 bake maps, which is probably more than there should be, I have something to work with. So let's open Photoshop and get to combining them. Now this is a weird process that I don't really know how it works, but it's just about getting both the shadow and ambient occlusion map data into one image that the game can read. So I'll throw both the shadow and AO map into one project. Then I'll select everything in the shadow map and cut it with Ctrl X. Now I need to go to the color channels of the ambient occlusion map and black out the blue channel, which leaves everything yellow now that only green and red are left. Then I can select the green channel and paste the shadow map in there, which leaves us with what I call a McDonald's map, but most people would probably call it a shadow plus AO map or something like that. I also duplicated this map and had a blurred version underneath to make everything slightly glow. This is something Squadaloo recommended as a sort of safety net for things being slightly unaligned, since it won't just cut off the shadow at the seams. Then I did the same for all the other textures, and honestly, all in all, this is one of my favorite processes so far. It's kinda tedious, but I don't really mind that. Plus, these maps just look cool. And now that I'm finished, I can re-export the Blender model since it has those new UV maps in it, and import it into Track Studio as well as the bake maps. Now it's worth noting that there's also such thing as a light map, which is exactly what it sounds like. But since I don't really have any emissive objects in this scene, I'll just skip that. I'll probably do one if I make a nighttime version of this track. There was a little difficulty at first with maps not looking quite right, so I had to rebake a couple of them. But after that, this looks so much better. The shadows in the alleyways, the ambient occlusion and corners, it really makes things look more complete. I also added a few more game objects, like sailboats and some more piantas, and I was able to give the leaf piles their particles back, which worked this time because I was using the deluxe PTCL file instead of the Wii U one that was causing issues before. So of course, this track isn't completely finished, but I think this is a good point to move on to a new project. I've got something planned for December that could just be the coolest thing I've done so far, or it could be a complete disaster, but either way, I know it'll be fun. I do want to release this track, but it might take a little bit to figure out how I'm gonna do that, so stay tuned for an update. I'd also love to revisit this track in the future, to fix things, add things, or even reinvent it a little for holidays. A spooky version of Delfino Square, or a snowy Christmas version. Well anyways, for now, that's all for Delfino Square. I hope you enjoyed watching. I'll talk to you later. Thanks.